It was late on a particularly cold December's evening when Sir Rueben Marlowe stood before the large, gilt-framed mirror in his study, a sheaf of papers in his hand, rehearsing the speech that he was obliged to give the following week in Parliament. He dreaded those occasions which called for a public performance, being reserved by nature, but it was required from time to time in his role as MP for the Metropolitan Borough of Kensington North. He barely regarded the still handsome figure that reflected back at him, so intent was he on learning his lines. If he had, he would have seen a bear of a man in his mid-50s, with a thick, steel-grey beard, flecked with iron colouring, an equally luxuriant head of hair, and large, soulful brown eyes. At 6 feet 2 inches and solidly built, he embodied all the gravitas required of a public speaker. His London townhouse had all the creature comforts of the late 19th century. Gas lighting, central heating and indoor plumbing. The larder was full, the wine cellar well stocked, and a log fire was blazing in the grate. The only thing it lacked was someone to share it with, besides the small company of servants, that is. And he had given those the night off, so that he would not be disturbed in his endeavour. And he had long resigned himself to being a bachelor. Amongst his London friends and acquaintances, there was none who would disturb him at so late an hour unannounced. It was, therefore, more than a surprise when he heard the front door-bell chime. Some other night he would have stayed silent and ignored it, but found, to his surprise, that far from being annoyed by the interruption, he actually welcomed it and responded to the call forthwith. The streets of Kensington were as still and silent as a churchyard at midnight. The ubiquitous yellow smog hung in the air, but no one was visible upon the opening of the door. In the instant, Marlowe experienced the queerest sensation. He shivered from head to foot reflexively. The hairs on the back of his neck bristled. It felt like the old adage, as though someone had walked over his grave. After a moment's hesitation, he descended the 4 front door steps and, crossing the pavement, stepped out into the cobbled street. He looked first left, then right, but there was neither sight nor sound of anyone. Stepping back inside the entrance hall, he slammed the door behind him and threw the bolts. He was still trying to shake the peculiar sensation he had experienced as he re-entered the study, only to see the figure of a man seated in an armchair beside the fire. A multitude of emotions coursed through his very being: fear, astonishment, disbelief, recognition, and, finally, a form of acceptance. It was the face of Darius, older now, yet not so old as he. But it could not be. Rueben. Darius smiled his familiar lopsided smile, but his eyes held their customary sadness. Please forgive the intrusion, but it is essential I see you this one last time. Marlowe stared at his old friend, open-mouthed. Darius had certainly changed, matured since he last saw him long ago when they were undergraduates at university. That was only to be expected, and despite the extra lines around his eyes and dishevelled appearance, he remained otherwise as virile and heroic as he ever had. What was not to be expected was Darius himself. "Can you drink?" Rueben asked. "I can," Darius replied. Rueben poured them both a large measure of whisky, handing one to Darius before sinking wearily into the chair opposite his old friend. Finally, he spoke. "But this cannot be, Darius. Yet I am here." "But you are dead." "Yes. You died at sea with all hands on the Marie Claire, if the newspaper accounts are to be believed." "Yes." "And that was years ago." 7 years ago this very night." "So why do you haunt me now?" Darius smiled wearily. "In hope of my reclamation." "Your reclamation?" "Yes." Darius put his tumbler aside. "I have travelled endlessly, interfering for good when I was able, trying to prove myself worthy." "Worthy of what?" "Worthy to pass over into the next blessed realm, but I cannot. I am not able. Oh, it has been a long and painful journey to your door tonight. You cannot imagine. I have begged, I have pleaded many times to have this audience with you, and at last it has been granted." "But why?" "Because you loved me once. I believe you loved me." Marlowe felt as though he'd been punched in the stomach. The walls he had so stoically built around himself teetered on the brink of collapse. Yes, he had loved Darius, loved him like no other, not before nor since. They had been inseparable for their 4 years at University College until that fateful, drunken night when he had attempted to kiss Darius on the mouth and been so violently repulsed. Nothing had felt the same thereafter. Their paths quickly diverged. Rueben had taken the right-hand path to respectability, and Darius the left, seeking more masculine adventure, far afield, adventure that had ultimately led to his death. "And what of it?" Marlowe stammered. "Oh, my dearest friend, it is only love that can save me now." "How so?" "I cannot pass on because I have never loved and been loved. I've known lust, of course. I knew you desired me, but I never realized at the time it was desire born of love. And I did not know how to process my own feelings. Love me, Rueben. Just love me." "How so?" Marlowe repeated. Darius stood. "Wrap your arms around me, and for all that we once meant to each other, tell me you love me." Rueben felt the prickling of tears behind his eyes as he stood and crossed to stand before his friend. They stared into each other's eyes for a brief moment. Then Rueben folded his arms around Darius and drew him to his chest. "I do love you," Marlowe said softly. "I always love you. I love you, Darius." And with these words, he felt a sense of relief he had never experienced before. It was a feeling so profound it surged throughout his entire body. Darius relaxed back and lifted his face, and Rueben kissed him full on the mouth. Kissed him again and again, covered Darius' tear-streaked face in kisses, then held him tightly once again. "And I love you," Darius replied. The sensation of deepest joy remained, as the figure Rueben held so tightly to his breast began to melt into him, to pass into his very being, until he found himself alone, with arms clasped tightly around himself. But not really alone. Rueben would never be alone again.